Well, hey everybody, it's Homer Hickam back again during the great coronavirus uh, quarantine, and for some of us have to be inside, and the rest of us are social distancing. And I've been reading from some of my books, uh, and I hope that you've enjoyed them. The book that I'm going to read from tonight is well, I've been a few people had asked for me to start reading some of the books that I've written that have to do with space, and I've written a number of them. Um, I've written Back to the Moon, which, according to the vice president, is one of his favorite books and the reason why we're going back to the moon. And well, that's what he told me. He's a politician, but he did tell me that. His wife, Mrs. Spence, said that she loved Rocket Boys, but she's a teacher, and of course she would. Um, Not to get political or anything. We're not doing politics here. I know them because I'm on the National Space Council. And let's see, I've written a book called Crater. Actually, it was a trilogy: the Helium-3 trilogy, Crater, Crescent, and Crater, True Blood, and the Lunar Rescue Company. And this book, Paco, the cat who meowed in space. And by the way, if you want any of these books that I've been reading from, or any of the other books, I've written 18 of them, by the way, and all done pretty well. You can go out on our website, homerhickam.com, and go to shop, and there you'll find the books, and I'll be happy to autograph them, inscribe them any way you want, and to anybody that you want. And Linda will go ahead and get them in the mail, because we can still do that. And so just to let you know, don't mean to sell my books here, but that's the truth. You can get them that way. But anyway, Paco the cat who meowed in space is a true story. And the reason I wrote it, as you can see, it's a rather thin book, and I'm going to give you an even more condensed version tonight, was that the Amazon folks called me, and they were starting up a program called Kindle Singles, which were novellas or books that were under 100 pages. And they asked me if I would write one for them, so that they could get started. Other authors would see it, and I said, sure, why not? And so it occurred to me that I did have this story that I'd go around telling folks when I was giving speeches about my cat, Paco, the cat who meowed in space. So again, I'm going to read a very condensed version of this. This book has a lot more information in it about what I did when I actually worked for NASA, and about the mission that we were on. But here goes a little bit from Paco, the cat who meowed in space. A true story. I once had a long-haired black and white cat who had a cute face, big golden eyes, a fluffy tail, marshmallow feet, and the sweetest nature any cat ever had in the history of the world. His name was Paco, and he was not only sweet, he was magic, because he could change people just by resting his gentle eyes on them, or by cocking his head in that special way he had, as if asking, "Why do you hurt? Why do you cry? Why do you allow sadness to waste a moment of your life?" People reported they forgot their aches and pains and fears and sadness any time Paco was around. That was his magic. Of course, Paco did normal cat things. He liked to chase squirrels and chipmunks, and he liked catnip toys, and he liked to lounge around on the furniture. He loved to nap on a big limestone outcropping in my yard, or just perch up there and enjoy the view, as far as I could tell. Paco lived every moment of his life with complete, total, and utter joy. Maybe it was the release of all that surplus inner joy that allowed Paco to fix people who needed fixing. I don't know. The only thing certain is Paco's magic came in handy when I needed him to save a space mission. How he did that and how he became the first cat to meow in space is what this story is about. One day, I noticed a cat lounging on my deck. He was black and white and had yellow gold eyes so big he looked permanently startled. When I opened the door, the cat stared at me, and all of a sudden time slowed down and the deck became just about the most pleasant place in the world. A bright, cheerful sun eased out from behind some clouds. Birds sweetly cheeped. Squirrels happily scampered. Trees gently rustled. And I think, though it hadn't rained, there might have even been a rainbow. All this marvelous stuff seemed to be emanating from this fluffy tuxedo cat who, having somehow made his universal point, went back to lolling on the deck while I went to the store for cat food. It didn't take long for me to learn the cat story from the neighbors next door. His name was Paco, and he belonged to the previous owners of the house. When Paco's family moved several miles away, Paco went with them, but the very next day he hiked back. After coming to get him several times only to see Paco return to his old neighborhood every time, they finally gave up. Now Paco was sort of everybody's cat in the neighborhood. Figuring I'd just be one of his many owners, I began to regularly feed Paco on the deck. Then one day I found him sitting at the door that led to the deck. I opened it. Paco came inside, had a look around, then looked at me, and I got the idea he was asking me if he could stay. "You're now my cat," I told him, and he smiled. Honest, cats can smile. If you know where to look, and I did, having been around cats all my life. My mom loved cats, and I guess I got her cat-loving gene. Everybody who came to visit me had the same opinion of Paco. "I love that cat," they'd cry after being in his company for a few minutes. Even my friend Carl Spurlock, a local television personality who usually had something acerbic and possibly ironic to say about just about everything, liked Paco. "That's some cat," he said as he and Paco sized each other up. "He's some cat," I agreed. "Everybody loves him." Paco, his eyes still locked on Carl, provided him with a meow. Paco had a great meow, vibrant, insistent, and strong. "What's wrong, buddy?" Carl anxiously asked. "Are you hungry? Doesn't Homer feed you?" "He's eaten twice this morning," I said, "including a chipmunk he got on his own." "I love this cat," Carl said. And so did Linda, my girlfriend. "I love this cat," she said the instant she met him. Paco waited every day for me to come home from work, perched on the limestone rocks that gave him a good view of the driveway. As soon as I got out of the car, he came running to jump into my arms. I really loved that cat. In fact, everybody who ever met him loved Paco, even if they thought they didn't like cats, because he could fix things in their heads and hearts. Friends told me when he was in their lap and purring, any sadness they felt turned to joy. They said when he looked at them with those big round eyes, the world just seemed to be a better place. Something he did just clicked the happy button in all of us. That was Paco's magic. And so it was that Paco became my cat, his manifest destiny to make everybody he met feel good about themselves, and incidentally, save a NASA mission and be the first cat to meow in space. My next assignment was in Japan, to go train the first Japanese astronauts and also some American astronauts that would be flying with them. Knowing that I would be gone for some months, I formed a team to look after Paco. We called it the Paco Support Team, or PST for short. Linda was the lead. Japan was a nice experience and I enjoyed it. The people there were wonderful, and the simulators and facilities they built were first class. Every week I called Linda and the others to see how Paco was going. All the reports were good. Paco was just fine. After the astronauts and I returned from Japan, off we went to NASA's Ames Research Center in Mountain View, California, to train on a very complex experiment that required a great deal of precision and a willingness to handle live frogs, extract eggs from them, and fertilize the eggs with the sperm from the male frogs to produce space tadpoles. The member of my crew primarily assigned the task was an astronaut I will call Jamie. Jamie was uniquely suited for the task in that she was experienced and loved the kind of laboratory research the experiment represented. After training, the scientist sponsoring the experiment raved over her performance, which made me, as the training manager, very happy. Unfortunately, she was considered somewhat aloof by the other astronauts, and some of them hoped she would be reassigned. But Jamie was left on the crew, which was just fine with me. One day while I was in Japan on the second training set, Linda called me with some very bad news. She'd gotten an urgent call from the neighbors who told her Paco had dragged himself to their house and seemed to be partially paralyzed. He could neither walk nor stand, and they thought he'd either been hit by a car or had a stroke. Linda had rushed him to the vet, who provided the diagnosis. Paco was suffering from feline vestibular disease, a neurological affliction that leaves cats unable to balance. In humans, this disease is also known as Alan Shepard's disease, which had grounded America's first astronaut for years. He's so pitiful, Linda said. I put him in your bathtub so he can't hurt himself. All he does is cry. He doesn't eat. He just keeps trying to stand up and then falls over. What does the vet recommend? I asked. Watch and wait, she said, but it might be permanent. Paco may never be able to walk again. Unspoken, of course, was a solution for any animal in pain and in need of relief. But I couldn't do that without seeing him, and I had another month to go in Japan. Keep him alive until I get home, I begged, and Linda agreed. She definitely would. She loved Paco so much. She took over his care, going morning and night to give him antibiotics and love. She also sent me daily reports for the remainder of my time in Japan, but sadly, they were not positive. Paco's improvement was slight, if at all. He was only able to drag himself to his bowl to eat and his litter box, where he often collapsed while trying to use it. For a proud cat, I knew this was unacceptable. Eventually, most of the training moved to Huntsville, which is where I lived then and live now, Alabama, at the Payload Crew Training Complex, PCTC, where we had mock-ups of the Space Lab module, complete with active experiment simulators. Over and over, we practiced the procedures for the space flight. During 1 week while the crew was there, I had a small party for them and some of the folks who would be working in the Payload Operations Control Center, which we called POC, during the flight. Jamie had a cat at home in Houston, and when I noticed her looking a little wistful, I asked her what was wrong. I missed my cat, she confided. Paco, still unable to walk, was in the back bedroom, but I decided that any cat in a crisis might do, so I invited her to see him. Jamie swept him up and cuddled him in her arms while his eyes danced. He was still having trouble focusing. Poor boy, she said, and I felt great sadness at the sight of him, once proud but now reduced to the state of near helplessness. Then I noticed that Jamie's eyes were wet. It was the only time I ever saw her lose the tight control she always kept on her emotions. I thought about putting him to sleep, I confessed. She glared. No, you won't. Before you do that, you give him to me. She tickled him under his chin. I'll take care of you forever, won't I, Paco? Paco replied with a purr, and I rejoined the party with the rest of the crew and payload flight controllers while Jamie sat apart in the bedroom with Paco. Finally, the Space Lab shuttle flight with Jamie was put into orbit. As one of the 3 crew interface coordinators, my primary crew responsibility was Jamie. I was required to be on shift when she was awake and ready to talk her through experiments. I cheered when the shuttle flawlessly launched and headed for my CIC console, even though it would be some hours before the experiment began. First, the module had to be prepared. This meant the hatch in the tunnel which led to the lab had to be opened, power supplied, air supplies checked, heating and cooling established, and so forth. This took a couple of shifts. During that time, I heard snatches of Jamie's voice, usually just a Roger or no. In System Status Report, I was surprised she had so little to say. The timeline was tight, and there was no time for conversation. Still, thinking of an experiment that she was doing that had to do with biofeedback, that is, not taking any medicine for something called space sickness. I'll have a little aside here. So what is space sickness? Well, when you go into space and you're in microgravity, or sometimes they call it 0G, what happens is that your leg muscles are so strong that they basically force fluid or your blood up into your upper torso and up into your head. So if you ever notice that astronauts sometimes have kind of a puffy look about their face, that's because a lot of their bodily fluid had been forced up out of their legs by their leg muscles, and it stays up in the upper torso and the head. And very, very often, this causes what we call space sickness. It's something like seasickness. The results are the same. You're very sick to your stomach, and wish that you would die. But most of the astronauts take, if they feel like that they're going to be prone to getting this, they will take well, it's a common seasick medicine, and they're able to control it. But Jamie didn't on this flight because she was involved with a biofeedback experiment where it was hoped by thinking in such a way and controlling it with your mind that maybe you wouldn't have to take medicine, because you don't really want to take a lot of medicine in space if you can get away with it. But Jamie didn't take anything, and she was all wired up for this biofeedback experiment. So, when it was time for me to talk to Jamie about her first experiment, she said, "Hailing frequencies are open," reflecting her love of the Star Trek series. "Roger that, Jamie," I said, followed by my reading of the timeline and some last-minute changes on the experiment about to be performed. There was no idle talk. After all, we were being listened to by thousands of people, including everyone in the POC in Houston and by the press. The first experiment up was a simple Japanese material science experiment, which required Jamie to insert a metal sample and turn on a furnace. She told me what she was doing as she did it, which allowed me and everyone else to figure out where she was on the timeline. This was important information. Space Lab was a limited duration spaceflight, which meant if X number of experiments were to be performed, they had to be accomplished in Y number of hours. It was important to stay as close to the predetermined schedule as possible. Although Jamie was working efficiently, I couldn't help but notice that she sounded tired. I immediately suspected she had space sickness. It's also called space adaptation syndrome, by the way. When we received video, I thought I detected stress in her tight-lipped expression. She was wearing the headband required by the biofeedback experiment, so I knew that meant if she was sick, she hadn't taken any drugs to help her past it. That, theoretically, at least, wasn't any of my business. The physical condition of the astronauts was one of the data points that Houston kept to itself. No one was allowed to know anything about the health of an astronaut except the flight surgeons. This, however, didn't keep me from trying to at least get an idea of how she was doing. Since one of the Houston flight docs was my friend, I asked him to let me know if I needed to know anything about Jamie. After cautioning me on the need to keep such knowledge to myself, he said, "She's sick. I mean, she's really sick. And she's also not sleeping very well." This, of course, was a bad situation, and I appreciated knowing about it. Not only was it rough on Jamie, it was also potentially going to be rough on the mission if she slowed down. The frog experiment was coming up, which required her to use a sophisticated glove box, and everything had to click right along. The tadpoles that were to be produced couldn't wait. They had to be on the timeline, too. "Is there anything I can do?" I asked. "No," the surgeon said. "But you know her better than I do. If you sense something more, let me know," and I promised I would. Jamie kept plowing through her experiments one after the other with total focus and success. Still, about the third day, I checked in with the flight doc again, who told me there was no improvement in Jamie's condition. I wanted to do something, but what could I possibly do? Then it came to me. Paco, my magic cat. Paco, among his many other attributes, was an excellent meower. If I set him down in front of a door, he'd meow to go through it, whether it was to go in or out. It was just his way. When I went home after my shift, I got a tape recorder, set Paco down in front of a door that led outside to the deck, and turned it on. Even though he couldn't walk without staggering, Paco started meowing as if he wanted out, and I let the recorder run for a minute, then two. Then I got dressed and headed back to the POC. This was a night Jamie had a very tricky procedure required to successfully complete the frog experiment. I sat down at my console and watched the digital clock click down the numbers until our next signal from the shuttle. When it came up, Jamie said with no real enthusiasm, "Hailing frequencies open." And I said, "Jamie, just wanted to let you know everybody down here appreciates all that you're doing, especially a certain someone. And I have a message from him to you." And then I turned on the tape recorder. "Meow, meow, meow, meow," Paco meowed, then added, "Meow, meow, meow, meow," before continuing on with, "Meow, meow, 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 meow. Meow. When Paco was finished, I turned off the player and heard Jamie say with unfeigned delight, "Who is that?" "That's your sweetie boy, Paco," I said. Jamie giggled, a sound I was certain I had never heard before, and said, "Well, tell Paco I said meow back." And then, according to my friend the flight doc, Jamie got perfectly well. Everything, all her symptoms, went down to zero and stayed that way for the remainder of the flight. In any case, it was evident by her voice, her bright eyes, and her smiles. All she needed was Paco. Of course, what I had done hadn't been approved by anybody except myself. Certainly, there was going to be ramifications. It would not have surprised me if the NASA constables had arrived and dragged me out of the park. I was already hearing over the voice network somebody saying, "Homer has finally lost it. He's meowing over the loops." As it turned out, the only thing that happened was a lady in NASA public relations called the next day. "I've been researching it," she said, "and I'm pretty sure that was the first time cat sounds have ever been heard in space." I was delighted with this news. Paco was the first cat to meow in space. He had also saved the space mission, or at least the frog experiment, which was a major part of it. This was pretty good for a sick, fluffy, black and white cat. When my shift was over that morning, I left the park and drove home to tell Paco how famous he was. I found him at the deck door, begging to go out. I led him and followed him outside. He looked at me, then jumped up on the deck rail and trotted along it. I told him about his sudden fame, idly petting him while he rubbed his head on my arms. Then it suddenly occurred to me what he'd just done. "You're walking and you're jumping," I cried, and Paco looked at me with an expression that seemed to say, "Well, of course." He wasn't completely cured, of course. For the rest of his life, Paco would hold his head kind of crooked, sort of like he was always asking a question, but he was cured enough for me to start dancing all around that deck with him. If a neighbor saw me, I'm sure they thought I was crazy, and I guess I was. Happy crazy. "You're a first-class cat, Paco," I told him. He shrugged, or did the cat equivalent, and jumped down from the rail and rolled over on the deck to let his tummy soak up the morning sun. Jamie was still triumphantly orbiting the Earth. I couldn't wait to tell her about Paco, who had managed a small triumph of his own. That's the Paco story. Paco, the cat who meowed in space. And I hope everybody's enjoyed it. There is a Kindle single on it and also an audiobook read by a professional, which includes, like I said, that was a very, very short version of it. Includes more about Paco and more about what I actually did for NASA at Marshall Space Flight Center here in Huntsville. And it was a great career, and I sure was glad that Paco was part of it, Linda was part of it, Carl, the whole payload support team. Psst. Love you guys. Love you all. Brenda Bradford. Lori Kegley. I mean, goodness. Amy Bandis. It was just great to have all of them looking after Paco. So thanks for listening, folks, and we'll see what next book I do. Let me know which one you'd like. HomerHickam.com. Thanks.